Bonjour et bienvenue au deuxième événement de Place
Hello
au débat.
and welcome to the second event of Up for Debate. I work with RAF Canada and I'm part of the organizational committee of the committee that wants to center trans and cis and LGBT women in the center of electoral problems. We think that our issues of women and LGBTQIA people should be taken into account. Our first was in 2015 and then in 2019. And since we're hearing wind of a potential electoral cycle, we're back. We asked to have an official debate of different electoral issues. Unfortunately, it can't function over the last two editions of the campaign. So this year we have other objectives, and we're very happy as a committee of organizers to see the number of organizers that are joining us, to be sure that trans and cis women's issues, as well as trans and two-spirit people, are important in terms of public policy. I have the great honor today of presenting in the name of my colleagues, Anne, Michelle, Kate, and Jacqueline of the Canadian Women's Foundation, Women's Shelter Canada, as well as Sarah of the Work Congress, this event, and our excellent moderator, Debbie, the VP of the Canadian Women's Foundation, who I will pass the microphone to. This event is our second call to action, and we're inviting you to follow us online to know a little bit what's going to be happening. And over to you. Thank you so much, Karine, and thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm going to start in English, and then I'm going to go to French.
Start with a short land acknowledgement about the work of Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations we support, which take place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories that are unceded and unsurrendered. I myself am in the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, and the place I find myself in is traditionally known as Tiohtià:ke, now called Montreal. We are grateful for this opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an effort to make right with all our relations. Je vais maintenant passer au français.
Now I will speak in French. And I'm just going to write a little bit the situation of violence, gender-based violence, presently happening in this space. And afterwards, I'm going to do an introduction of our panelists. I'm very, very honored to be with these extraordinary people. And then we'll start with questions. And then we'll have questions, and you will have an opportunity to ask your own questions. So according to OMS estimations, 35% of handicapped women were exposed to physical and sexual violence by their intimate partners. And it's a major problem and persistent problem that was existent even before the pandemic. Women who live with a handicap are twice as likely to be victims of violent crime and twice as likely to be subjected to sexual violence. Indigenous women are much more likely to deal with this kind of sexual violence. The ampler the extent of this crisis shows that violence is linked to discrimination and anchored in a society that is inherently ableist, colonial, racist, and racism that is anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. This hasn't changed for the last 30 years.
The impact of gender-based violence is horrendous, and the impacts for some groups are worse, as noted. Women, two-spirit, and gender-diverse people experience PTSD, anxiety, depression, serious ongoing traumatic brain injuries, and physical trauma as a result of violence, not to mention serious financial impacts and many differing effects on their community work, their parenting, family and relationship dynamics, and their roles and responsibilities as community leaders. All of these are exacerbated by systemic oppressions. We know that Black women are treated more harshly, receive less care and less protection than other women. When they are trying to access services, they are frequently re-victimized by the process of reporting and prosecuting. The level of systemic racism in service agencies and an increased danger to their community as a whole related to investigation techniques and police surveillance place additional barriers on reporting and healing from violence for Black women and Black gender diverse and trans people. At a point where on average, 2 women are murdered by current or previous partners every 6 days, we must take action. This number has gone up in recent months. The rates are almost 6 times higher for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. Last week, Nathalie Pichet in Quebec City and Hanadi Mohamed in Ottawa were both killed by previous or present partners. It is in this context that we bring you the news and information from our panelists, both historic and up-to-date information on why women in Canada experience these levels of violence and why different groups are experiencing different levels of violence. I'm thrilled to have such incredible experts with us today. And I am very much looking forward to their comments, which I know will be extremely pertinent and eye-opening for many of us. I'll introduce you very quickly to who they are and then ask my first question. So first of all, we have Josie Nepinak. Sorry, I know how to say your name, Josie. I'm just very moved that you're with us today. Josie Nepinak from our Taan Healing Lodge in Calgary. She will introduce herself more in a moment. We have Bonnie Brayton, who is the CEO and president of DAWN-RAFN Canada, Disabled Women's Network Canada. And we have Debbie Owosu-Akyeeah from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity based in Ottawa. So I'll ask my first question and then pass it over to Josie. So the first question is really just an opportunity for us to think about gender-based violence with a feminist intersectional lens. So Josie, how do you see the federal government addressing gender-based violence? Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences of what is going on and also what is missing?
Yes, thank you very much. And I bring you greetings from the beautiful city of Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary, also known as Treaty 7 territory and homeland of the Métis peoples. So thank you. So a couple of years ago, our Prime Minister said that the relationship with Indigenous peoples is the most important for him. And he also said that he was a feminist. And so, you know, my challenge is let's get him to put his words into action. Violence and killing of Indigenous women is an epidemic, as we all know, and requires immediate interventions and supports. For example, since the MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls 2S report was delivered in 2019, 73 Indigenous women had been killed, an average of 3 women per month. We are impacted by colonial history that has stripped women of their rights and their place of value within not only Indigenous societies, but society in general. We are subject to acts of genocide. For example, mass killings of thousands of women, deliberate and forced removal of children so that they will not be under the influence of, quote unquote, their savage parents. The Indian Act, which specifically targets Indigenous women and their children. Forced sterilization in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Starvation of children and electrocution of children. Denial of proper health care. Lack of safe drinking water. The unmarked graves of children who never made it home. And this is just the beginning as the discovery continues to grow around the unmarked graves. We also have COVID and the increase in isolation and community supports. And whether we will ever go back to the way it was, I don't think the way it was ever working to begin with. So let's move forward in a good way. I would ask our Prime Minister to put an end to the acts of genocide against Indigenous peoples in this country and to move towards truth and reconciliation. Now, all of the governments in this country since Confederation have known about these acts of genocide, and no one has stopped the genocide. We require immediate action to address these atrocities and crimes against humanity. So together, all of these factors contribute to the experience of Indigenous women in contemporary society. We are overrepresented in gender-based violence, sexual violence. We are over-policed, yet we are underserved by the justice system. I want to give you a little quote that I read yesterday on a friend's Facebook. It says, "I was born Indigenous and I will die Indigenous. I just don't want to die because I'm Indigenous." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josie. I very much appreciate your comments, and I'm sure they have echoed with many of our audience, and we've learnt new things today also, thanks to what you've shared. So over to you, Debbie, now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I am joining you today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I love this question, not only because my response is informed by like my lived experience as a Black queer woman, but I get to also touch on things I'm currently doing in my role at the CCGSD. But then also I have some insight as someone who was a public servant actually working on gender equality and gender-based violence issues. I'll acknowledge the fact that the federal government has made, I'll say, significant amount of commitments made to ensure that responses to gender equality, actually include 2S LGBTQ+ people, whether this was through the actual renaming of the Department of Women and Gender Equality, whether it was the establishment of the LGBTQ Secretariat, the 2S LGBTQ+ capacity funding, and even recently the $50 million project funding that was announced in the federal budget. However, despite the federal government's best intentions on advancing gender equality with respect to sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity or expression, the government still defaults to equating gender from a very colonialist binary view of gender, and this is across departments. So not only is this cis-sexist, but it still centers this heterosexist idea that gender equality really just means cisgender women and girls who face violence, intimately or not, by men. It ignores that homophobia and transphobia, by virtue of being harmful responses to people like myself, not performing gender the way that they're supposed to, these are gender-based violences in themselves under the same patriarchal umbrella that misogyny also is included in. And it also ignores that violence perpetuated by people who aren't men and by institutions and spaces supposedly centered on social justice. And I'm actually speaking about feminist spaces here. Even in Wage's recent Feminist Response and Recovery Fund, and this would have been a fund that would have benefited a number of queer and trans orgs addressing GBV, it had in the fine print, if you weren't really looking, language that actually prevented LGBTQ organizations from applying, including my own, because we weren't seen as doing significant women's programming. However, on the flip side, women's organizations who did apply for projects where they, included gender diverse people, that was a-okay. I think one thing that we need to recognize when the federal government does this is that it continues to create this cycle where LGBT organizations and women's organizations are pitted against each other to get funding to do the important work we're doing in our communities. And that competition is a manufactured one, just so that we're all aware. It's obviously a problem. And it's also a problem because some women's organizations who actually have very hard-lined anti-trans stances have been funded by the federal government. So we need to talk about what other standards are in place by the feds to ensure that feminist responses to GBV do not cause further harm to those who are living in the margins. So there needs to be a challenge on what exactly the federal government defines as gender-based violence. There has to be stronger language in any national action plan or even funding strategies addressing GBV that explicitly states homophobia, transphobia, biphobia as being gender-based violences. And for fellow feminists, including those who are working in civil society organizations, we need to confront transphobia in our own work. So the only way for public policy issues and problems that we're seeing, like violence towards 2S LGBTQ people, to have the proper public policy responses, we need to see 2S LGBTQ people centered in these conversations and our leadership being included in this as well. And so those are a little bit about my own perspectives, and I'm excited to continue the conversation with you all today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Debbie. And thank you for highlighting again the systemic violence and how it manifests itself through constructions that are both colonial and patriarchal. I really appreciate you reminding us of that. And I just want to underline the need that I heard loud and clear that feminist organizations take a stance and understand the needs of Two-Spirit LGBTQ communities and how our language does often exclude those groups. And that's work that is definitely ongoing, and I appreciate your leadership in that. Thank you. And over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you so much, Anu. And of course, I really want to thank my fellow panelists, Josie and Debbie. There's a lot you said that I don't feel like I need to cover because you've done such a good job of talking about some of the recommendations already. I'm coming to you from Montreal, from the unceded territory de Kanaka, and I really appreciate Up for Debate having this particular panel, especially with these folks and this conversation. And so in terms of, I would say starting off with something that I think became quite clear through COVID-19, right? It provided us with quite a microscope on the discrimination and violence that some women in particular experienced at higher rates. And I would say that it was certainly a good opportunity to see something that we understand, which is that women with disabilities, because COVID-19 created more isolation, greatly increased the risk for women with disabilities because they already live with issues of isolation, congregate living, many of the kind of things that create risk for both COVID-19 and for gender-based violence. So kind of a perfect storm, if you will. And I would say that it's important for people to hear something else, is that for many of us from the disability community, the passage of MAID during COVID-19 was something important that was playing as a very dark and scary backdrop for many women with disabilities who felt even more marginalized by hearing that legislation was being passed by this government that made, pardon the association with the word, that made it that disability would be a reason to ask for death. And that under the circumstances where a good life is not offered to somebody, that these particular choices, while I'm not trying to get into a long debate, become really significant and, like I said, did great harm to women with disabilities just in the way that they felt, and certainly the way that I think they felt responded to. We did some important research with the Live Work Well Center of Guelph that would be available through Dawn Canada and or through the Live Work Well Center at Guelph that talks a great deal about the specifics of what some of that research showed. And I would say that the most important thing that I want to say is that it was a terrifying reminder to women with disabilities of how deeply ableism resides in Canada, including with our legislators, with our media, and with the majority of people in Canada who still do not understand why this is such a problem, even though it's legislation now. And in terms of the history of intersectional feminism and it's being rooted, I think it's really important to talk about the fact that it's rooted with Black women. I want to say something that I think is important, which is that it was because it recognized that rather than being marginalized by others, Black women wanted a practice and something that responded and recognized their experiences and that didn't exist.
Bonnie, I'm just going to, sorry to interrupt you. I just need you to lean in a bit closer to your computer. The sound is cutting out a tiny bit.
All right, thank you for letting me know.
Thank you.
Okay. And so in terms of the National Action Plan, you know, because Canada has adopted the National Action Plan, the 10-year plan, I think there's something to be said about that that's important to recognize, something we were all fighting for. But I think it's also important to recognize that the reason I think it's important and that many of us here today think it's important is because it's a 10-year plan. And that means we're going to try and get at some of the systemic stuff that doesn't get dealt with. And I was going to say, Dawn Canada has actually recently finished up our 35th year in service. And for the same reason, are embarked on a 10-year initiative because we see the same things, which is that with systemic racism, ableism, transphobia, and a lot of the other things that my other colleagues have been talking about, we really need a kind of big collective action plan that's going to start to address these things at a systemic level. How am I doing for time? I knew because I want to kind of measure 1 minute left. Okay, so I was going to say I had a lot more that I was going to focus on in terms of course, the realities for women with disabilities in the context of violence. But I want to say, I think most importantly, that right now it's quite clear that there are very limited and almost no specific resources for women and girls with disabilities, that's a really key thing. But I think the thing that I want to say in the context of this discussion with my colleagues is the Federal National Action Plan got off to a very rushed start. And I think that in and of itself, like I said, speaks to something that I know my colleagues are concerned with, which is you can't rush something like this. And that the whole reason we have a 10-year plan is because we need to take some time and we need to center the marginalized voices. And I don't mean that in a tokenistic way. I truly mean that at the front end of this National Action Plan, if we don't center marginalized women and make us the center of this conversation, we continue to do what we have done. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my notes if I have. If not, we remain at the margins and nothing changes. I think the most important point I want to make, if you don't take a new approach with the National Action Plan, if feminist organizations and the government itself doesn't understand that the rights holders that represent women with disabilities, Black and Indigenous women, and women across the LGBTQ and other people in, sorry, I'll leave it there. I'm sorry. Thanks. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Bonnie. And I think what I heard at that point when you were talking about being rights holders, that is really central to our conversation on GBV, because we have the right to live without violence amongst all the other rights that are, you know, tied up in and that are not recognized or fulfilled or respected in any of the forms of discrimination and oppression that I think you've all spoken to today.
And I want to make that point, Anu, which is that around that idea that it's very important for others inside this space who are thinking about this to understand that the rights holders who are the most marginalized have the most complex way in, if you will, from a human rights perspective and from any other perspective, because we are holding more than one thing at this point. And while I'm not saying it's easy for anyone, it's important for those who are at the center now to understand that they're at the center with those resources and we're at the margins and we need to be there. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thank you very much. And so I'm just going to remind everyone to not only speak clearly and closely, but also more slowly for our interpreters. They're doing a fantastic job. We very much would like to thank them for their support so that we can communicate more clearly with more groups of people. But we should all try and slow down, and which is hard when you're so passionate about things. So I'll move on to my next question. And again, we'll start this time with Debbie. And so we're looking at next steps. So we've started to describe a little bit about policy. We've tried to say some of the ways that particularly the federal government is taking steps. But Josie made the point, we don't want to go back to normal. Because there was nothing that was suiting anybody back then before the pandemic. But at the same time, there are new challenges and new things emerging that have manifested in different ways, partially because of COVID, but also because of discoveries and legislation that has passed during this period of time, whether we're talking about medical assistance in dying, that Bonnie mentioned, or changes to the Indian Act, S3, that hasn't properly been implemented. You know, there's many things that are still hanging out there. So maybe we can ask you to start off by just saying, what would you like to see on the table? Where is this going for us all moving forward? Debbie.
Thank you. Kind of before I dive in, I do also want to contextualize that the Bill C6 on banning conversion therapy, I believe, goes to be voted on today before it moves to the next stage. And so that's an important thing for us to think about when we're looking at violences towards 2S LGBTQ people and how nuanced it is. So thank you. I wanted to just add that. But to answer the question, I think as we're reopening, we're already seeing with certain instances in the news across the country that violences, specifically hate crimes towards queer and trans people, are happening and they're rising. And we're also seeing at the same time this further, much more insidious, but also highly coordinated organizing that's pushing back against trans inclusion. And it's being done through public spaces. Here in Ottawa, there was a poster campaign specifically targeting trans feminine and trans women people. If at the end of this pandemic, if it is happening, and this return to normalcy comes back, and it includes queer and trans people still living in fear, I don't want it. Our communities don't want it. I think our feminist approaches to public policy need to shake up a little bit, and they need to be a little bit more bolder. Like, enough with this status quo and just tacking on gender diverse when we're talking about women's issues. We need to really mean it. And sometimes really meaning it requires a thorough engagement with queer and trans people and gender diverse people when it comes to policy development across all social issues, and it requires their leadership. Recent statistics from Stats Canada have given us a more concrete number of how many 2S LGBTQ people there are in Canada. There's 1 million of us. And 30% of those people are under the age of, or between the ages of 12 and 24. So young 2S LGBTQ people need to be centered in the conversation, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. You know, with the upcoming 2S LGBTQ action plan, I'd love to see an overlap with that, with other action plans, including the one on gender-based violence and other national strategies. And like I mentioned, our issues, like, they cut across all departments and social issues: GBV, housing, youth issues, childcare, income security. Bold public policy also can't just stop at the federal level. And it actually sometimes relies on federal governments, municipal and provincial, actually collaborating. And so one concrete thing, especially from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, that we really like to see and that we're talking about is addressing root causes that impact 2S LGBTQ youth. And we've been seeing a direct relationship between the harms that they face and the education system. It is the place where young people spend the most of their time, and it is the institution that causes the most harm to 2S LGBTQ people and the space in where they're dealing with the most violence. And so I kind of want to see our federal government moving past this idea that jurisdictions are a thing and that prevents them from being bold with action. shake things up. I want to see a national strategy on 2S LGBTQ inclusion that includes a mandated national comprehensive sex education. I want to see that, and I want to see queer and trans issues at the forefront. Not only will it normalize our issues, but will allow 2S LGBTQ people and young people to see themselves reflected. And it's long-term cultural change. These are the things that we need to see to minimize violence and to ensure that we really, truly feel included.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much. I will remind people that we have a question period at the end of the panelists. You've got 2 more panelists, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. So please feel free to put messages or questions in the chat. We will take questions also directly from you at the end. So you can turn on your mics and your videos and also pose questions directly to the panelists. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Josie. Thanks, Josie.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I think one of the things that that I'd like to identify, and things are changing, of course, but a lot of the influences right now are around Indigenous women. We're based primarily from white women. And we need to acknowledge that, because no longer do we live in a paternalistic world where, you know, where we get that little pat on the back and say, you're a good little Indian, but we're going to do it for you because you can't do it. You know, we need to move away from that kind of attitude and allow us as Indigenous women to be front and center of our issues. I mean, that's one of the big recommendations that came out of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, is that quite often we, you know, we're not seen as experts and of our experiences, or typically, you know, if we're involved at a table where, you know, for example, I'm the only brown face at the table, you know, my words quickly get drowned out because everybody else is non-brown, and so no one pays attention to that. The other piece is around the language, the language around, the language that I'd like to see is, we need to use words like colonialism. We need to use words like genocide, crimes against humanity, paternalistic policy, racism, all of those isms to be part of the language, to change the narrative of Indigenous women's experiences, whether they're in the research. We need to go back to some of the language that our Indigenous grandmothers, and using Indigenous-based feminism to talk about the women's place in the community in terms of the equality that my grandmothers had with our grandfathers, and to take spirit back into that work that we're doing. And by that I mean that everyone in the circle is equal. There is no spirit knows no color, is what I've been told. And so we need to embrace those philosophies, and that everyone brings voice to those communities, because they know best their solutions and how to bring them back. One of the things that I would like to see is an oversight body that will ensure that that the national action plans, whether Indigenous or the others, are reported back to community for accountability. I'd like to see that, to talk about the strengths and the challenges, and to ensure that there is equal space for everyone at that table. We must continue to hold them accountable. As I said, Indigenous women's voices need to be front and center of Indigenous women's issues, particularly around policy, programs, funding sources, and supported to develop those strategies. Quite often I find that, and still today, as a matter of fact, I had an experience this morning that I still feel that we're in subordinate positions because we are not resourced as well as other non-Indigenous organizations. And there seems to be more of that overlooking our shoulders continuously to ensure that we're doing the right thing. And to me, that is a trust issue between government and Indigenous. So going back to what we know best is that our Indigenous grandmothers, and using their voices and bringing some of that ancient wisdom back to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. Thank you for the reminder too of the extent to which there needs to be change throughout, not just government, but movements and in partnerships and in allyship, that we have to address colonialism and colonized practices in our own ways that we work together. So thank you for that. Bonnie, over to you, and then I will take questions.
Thank you, and of course, thank you again to my panelists, because they say such wonderful things. So I'm going to do something practical first, which is to say some specific things that I think are really important to talk about in the context of policy, which is, to begin with, in terms of from DAWN Canada's perspective, is to understand how important peer support is, and that the absence of peer support is this huge, massive problem for women and girls with disabilities who are not represented at those tables. We were talking about the table and this whole problem, Josie and Debbie, right, of finding yourself at the table and being that only voice. Well, there just aren't any organizations for women and girls with disabilities in this country. There's a handful. There's DAWN Canada and a couple of, one provincial and another local, but that's all there is. And again, 24% of women in Canada is Statistics Canada number, but let's just add the race lens and understand that the rate of disability among Indigenous and Black women is above 30%, above 30%, and that the connections are there because racism and gender-based violence and the connections between those two are disability. Like I said, that's an intersection that needs to be really clearly understood in these conversations about gender-based violence, because of the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous and women with disabilities in prisons, in the homeless populations, because that's an intersecting reality. So in terms of some of the recommendations that I wanted to speak to first, again, peer support, funding and partnerships, these are really important to the success of the National Action Plan. And those partnerships have to be ones that are genuine, not created by a funding proposal, but ones that do the deep work around what intersectional practice is going to look like for all of us. Support across the life course has to be something we talk about, because nobody wants to talk about it, but it's childhood sexual abuse that is the beginning of this conversation that none of us really want to have, but we really need to understand that that's an important connection we're not making in our policy work. Data collection, we talked about that, of course, and of how important the data collection is going to be. Cross-disability and intersectional, that's Dawn's central message, is that the approach we need to take if we're going to make any meaningful change, because again, the rates of disability among Black and Indigenous women are above 30%. Let's be really clear, and I know as well that if you add the intersection around sexual orientation, again, there's significant numbers there. Education and awareness, because yes, we're still dealing with all those isms, aren't we? We keep talking about the isms, and it's time to really, really concretely understand them and use the language, like Josie said, the kind of language that needs to be used to be clear. And let's not pretend there's no elephants in our sisterhood room, because there's some big, ugly ones we've got to talk about. The need to dismantle systemic barriers, so critical, and something my sisters already spoke about. System navigation. For women with disabilities, for so many of the women we are talking about, that system navigation piece is so critical, and they're not getting it, and we're not giving it to them. Front line, system navigation. And finally, what I want to do is tie all of this up because of something Debbie said, and it's something that's driving me crazy. Budget 2021 promised all kinds of things, and it's a very generous budget, but it's not focused. And as we know, there's a national housing strategy. There are all the other strategies that were named, the national housing strategy, the national action plan, and now we have wonderful news. We have a national accessible childcare initiative that's begun. And if we look at all of these things in a long view, we begin to understand how much they all connect. There's now funding for a national health, intersectional health information. So can I just say that all that I want, that Debbie wants, that Josie and all of us want, is for there to be a threading of the needle, an understanding that these things cannot continue in silos, because that's why we're also at the margin. And it's not our job to thread the needle. It's our job to be there to help you thread the needle with the expertise and the knowledge that we carry, The women from the margins at the center is, in my view, the way we go forward. How much time am I done? Probably done, Anu. Yes, I should stop there and we'll go to questions maybe. So thank
You're
you.
never done, Bonnie. It's never done. That is the thing. We are here with hope for an energy because the work still needs to be done. And I am grateful and very, very, very blessed that you are all here on this journey. So thank you. Thank you for that. And I think the 2 points that stood out to me, Bonnie, just really sort of jumped out at me was the lifelong prevention point. About this is not about a person's at a particular point, but the violence that is often repeated and repeated throughout the life cycle. And the combination of the words intersectional and practice. And I think that's where we are. It's the crux of where we are right now. And we've got some good work to do there also. So I thank you for, as well as everything else and all of the panelists, thank you for what you've offered so far. We are now going to open the floor to questions. There is the possibility of asking a direct question. So I'm going to give people a couple of minutes to raise their hands or send a chat message to think of a question. I can also ask you one because I have one more point that we can discuss, which I think is very, very important given comments you've already made. So maybe I'll do that while we wait for the attendees to come up with a question if they have one. So one of the calls to action that Up for Debate mentioned is the additional violence that is faced through criminalization and what's basically state violence, systemic violence from institutions and state actors. And I know that you've all made comments about that in your remarks, especially Josie, I think some of your opening remarks to question 1 about the ways that the institutions have treated Indigenous people. So I don't know if you want to start, but if you have specific additional points about criminalization and systemic violence through state actors, you can either jump in one after the other, or I'll invite Josie maybe to start us off.
Yeah. Well, I think about the women that are that are in the sex trade and who are criminalized because they are doing work that is required, for example, to feed their families or to live in general and to have a home. And so the lack of trust around policing as well. And dare any woman to go to a police, even to a police officer, even if she was in a very severe, because of the dismissive attitudes around Indigenous women. And you know, just had a case here last week where a woman went, there was a big party in her next door to her, and she went over and asked them to be quiet, and 3 people beat her up, and she called the police, and guess who was arrested? She was arrested. So that's the continued victimization and criminality of Indigenous peoples in this country. I mean, we look at another case with Angela Cardinal here in Alberta, who was sexually assaulted and was arrested as well. The judge ordered that she be put in a holding cell for a few days. And the whole point here was that she was transported to and from the holding cell with the man who had sexually assaulted her in the same van. And those are just some examples of what happens with the criminalization and the carding. Of course, who, as an Indigenous person, you're more likely to get stopped driving down the streets and asked whether or not, is this your car, you know, through racist attitudes. So there are many situations that happen that create those spaces that that we're over criminalized and over policed in this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Josie. I see Bonnie. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to build off Josie's comments because indeed, there was, of course, in 2014, some legislation before the courts around sex work in Canada at that time. And there was some research done, and that was some really good research done out of British Columbia with about 3,000 sex workers. And what that found, and what it affirms in terms of what Josie has said, is that 35% of those sex workers said they had a long-term disability before they became sex workers. So I want to make that connection, and then add further to that, that indeed, as Josie points out, the overrepresentation of women with disabilities, Indigenous women and Black women in prison. Another piece of research, so this is women in prisons in Ontario, Josie, I'm sure you'll appreciate this one. Women in prisons in Ontario. So a study showed that 40% of those women in prisons in Ontario had a couple of things in common. And that would be a history of childhood sexual abuse and a traumatic brain injury. Two things that connected 40% of women in prisons. And while I will say, unfortunately, the researcher did not add the race lens, we can rest assured, almost certainly, that in terms of sexual orientation and or race, that we know that those other representations were there. So yeah, I think it's really important. And I'm very glad you raised it, Anna, because like I said, I think it's a hugely important element of these conversations that doesn't get had. Because when we're talking about gender-based violence again, and it was mentioned earlier, we know that a high number of women who experience gender-based violence also experience a brain injury. That one of the things they can experience is either a traumatic brain injury or from long-term abuse, something called an acquired brain injury. And one of my greatest challenges and disappointments was to see the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry go forward without there being proper inquiry into the fact that many of the women that we were talking about in that context were women who had an unmet disability and an unmet diagnosis, and were not supported and were not believed or understood to be where they were. So I'm really grateful you brought this question forward, and I'll leave Debbie with the last word on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add on to what my lovely co-panelists have mentioned, I do appreciate this question, and I think it's really timely considering that it is Pride Month. And I know folks have probably heard the slogan before that Pride is a protest, but it would be remiss for me not to mention that the Stonewall riot that sparked the movement for queer and trans rights in North America, but across the world, started as a response to police violence. And so for our communities, the relationship with the policing system, both locally, and I would also include with the RCMP as well, has been a contested one. And I think the lens of intersectionality is very, very important, because I think with the work of what Black Lives Matter did at the 2016 Toronto Pride March, which I think brought a mirror to our community, showed that depending on your level of privilege within our community, your response towards police violence was completely different. And it goes back to the issue of our community being centered on what queer, cisgendered white men experience, which is a lot of privilege. And it totally erases the fact that a significant amount of trans women, who are usually Indigenous and Black, have limited options for employment as a result of transphobia that we see in the employment system. And so when sex work is the option that they take, oftentimes to protect themselves, violence comes up, and the response from the police is their arrest. And then the further victimization and further transphobic violence they have to deal with is being put into male prisons. And this is a conversation that I know is still happening. And there is anti-trans organizing to continue to push against the work that's happening to ensure that trans women go to women prisons when they have to deal with the justice system. And I also want to point out the contested issues with trust of the police. I'm sure folks have heard of Bruce MacArthur in Toronto, who was terrorizing the Toronto Pride Village and Queer Village. It was not until a white queer man was one of his victims that when the police actually took the concerns of the community seriously. And we've seen this in Vancouver, We've seen this in Edmonton, we see it in Toronto, and in this particular case, community ends up being the one that shows up for each other in response to not wanting to deal with the justice system, because over and over again, we end up disappointed and further victimized. And so I just wanted to add that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, not only at the local level, but also federally with the RCMP, who monitors our movements. It's happening, it continues to happen. And so I think transformative work that needs to happen on that institution is super important, especially for 2S LGBTQ people.
I just wanted to add something to what Debbie said, because of course I can't not think about Black Lives Matter and the number of men and women and trans folks that have been beaten, harassed, or killed by police who also had a disability, right? Where there's absolutely no consideration of anything except you are Black and therefore I am on you. And like I said, I can't speak as somebody who has that lived experience, but I know from all of what we have seen that this is clearly, like you said, clearly and a really important element we need to understand, because it's something that is experienced very particularly by some communities more than others, and something, like I said, that the larger feminist community doesn't recognize even as a form of violence at this point. And I think what we're talking about today is you need to really recognize there's more than one kind of violence, and that the ones we're experiencing are the same as you, plus, plus, plus. And that's the only time we'll use the damn plus.
Well said, well said. And I really do think that one of the things that you've all exposed and brought to our attention today and reminded us all of is the importance of thinking of violence and gender-based violence in this very expansive sense that includes systemic violence, that includes state violence, because it can't be separated, because that state is patriarchal, because that state is a settler colonial state, because it's been set up to eradicate Indigenous peoples and enslave based on the enslavement of Black people. Its very structures reiterate that violence, eugenic practices, etc., etc. So we have to name them, and Josie, just going back to what you said, those words have to be used, because until they're exposed, we cannot get to root causes, and root causes is the way to eventually like pull out gender-based violence. So I thank you very, very much for the comments and continuing to make them and continuing to remind us. We are coming to a close and we don't have another question. So maybe in your closing comments, this is a bit of a question that I'm just going to put on you, because I think you've demonstrated your passion and your fight and your hope today. And I would just really love if you don't mind closing with something about where you get that from as you move forward, especially when things are changing slowly, but when when you're confronting things that are seem like you've said it 100 times, why do I have to say it again? Where do you keep on getting that energy from? And just as an inspiration, we hope, for other warriors in the group with us. So I maybe will start with Debbie. Although Josie, you've unmuted, so if you wanted to jump in, please do.
Okay, I will jump in. Well, I grew up in an environment where my grandmothers were the voice in the community, and did everything as equal as the men did in the community. So there was no there were no lines drawn. Everyone, you're part of a community. You do what you need to do. So growing up in that environment and seeing the strength in the community, and I'm not using terminology like matriarchy or patriarchy. I'm not using that terminology because to me, from my experience, those are colonial terms. Because we have terms in my language, which is the Anishinaabe language, that speaks to the role of our folks. We don't even have a term for gender in my, so I built strength from that, but also from the fact that my aunt was murdered in 1976. And there were no answers. There was no accountability. My grandparents at the time spoke very little English. They got a phone call from the police telling them their daughter was dead. She had 2 little girls who are now wonderful young women. And then 10 years ago, my cousin went missing in Winnipeg, and she's never been found. So I do that work because I have witnessed and lived in genocide and systemic oppression since I entered the residential school at 5 years old. And so I recognize the profound oppression, not being able to speak the language, to visit with your family, to and all of those things, that the physical, the sexual, the financial, spiritual abuse that I've experienced. So it drives me to the extent that I drive myself crazy sometimes, you know, because you have to have voice. You find space. We are growing another group of really young, powerful Indigenous women as we speak. We're going back to models that work around Indigenous-based feminism. That drives me every day. So thank you for having me, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well. So thank you very much, and virtual hugs. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I love this question, especially as a rookie ED doing this work, where I find myself dealing with burnout all the time, and then sometimes dealing with levels of imposter syndrome, being the only one in the room, which I'm sure a lot of people understand. But I think I get the energy that I have to be able to come and show up to spaces like this. I'll say this from other Black queer women, 100%. The amount of love and support that Black queer women continue to show, not only to me, but I would say our entire communities, fills me with light, whether it's a message I would get in my DMs on Instagram, or if it's an email I receive from a colleague of mine in a different organization in a different part of the sector. That energy keeps me going, because I know that there's like a group of other powerful, fierce femmes who want to see me successful, and I also want to see them successful. And we're also just continuing that reciprocity with our community. And I think what also attached to that keeps me going is that, although this is not my intention, but it happens, I get to be a possibility model to another younger queer Black girl who is looking for the possibility of what it could be like for her in the future. I remember what it was like to want to have those images, that example, and I was able to like see that when my best friend's mom took us to Dyke March in Toronto, when I saw Jamaican like lesbian feminists like rocking it. I got to see that, and I get to be that for someone else, and so that definitely keeps me going.
So beautiful. Oh. And as some people may know, I actually carried the name, my name is Hope, for a while because I needed it sometimes, and sometimes we do in the work. But I'm generally a glass half full person, and I would say I owe some of that to my father. So props to my dad. Father's Day just passed. He's been gone a while, but I still honor him because he always, always, always did more. And I don't know how he did all the things he did. But I would say I get my hope sometimes from somewhere deep, and sometimes it's because of some of the voices I have in my head that I feel like I have a reason to be that person for. And sometimes it's Ashley Smith. Sometimes it's some of the women I could think of from over this past year, Ruth and Susan and some of the other women I've named over this last year. But I think I'm the same as Debbie, and perhaps what I've also heard from Josie, which is I get it from my own. Last week, I had some very tough conversations around intersectional feminism, but I finished my week at UN-CSD, at UN Conference of State Parties for People with Disabilities, at side events with other women with disabilities who are from around the world kind of are dealing with the same things and the same challenges. And every time we put our heads together, 5 minutes in and we've got our agenda, we know what we want to talk about and where we are, and we feel better because we have this shared experience. So I would say I hope for all of us that someday we're not talking about it having to be the people we share directly with, and instead it's this larger circle where we can feel safe the same way. Because I know that is something we want, and I know that the larger feminist circles aspire to that. But I will say something that I think was important to me in my work, which is you have to be humble to get this right. And it's taken me my whole life to be, and I'm not saying I'm humble enough, but I try very hard to be humble every day in my work. And that the best work that I can do at DAWN is to lead from behind. And that is the same thing I think that me and Debbie and Josie and all of us who come from the margins are trying to say, is lead from behind and center the margins, and let's get this done right. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your incredible generosity in sharing with us today. And thank you for all of the work you do. And thank you on behalf of the people listening today, that you have been able to be so clear and open about the work that you do and why you do it. And I'm going to hand it back without further ado to Karine for a few closing remarks. But I just want to tell you personally, I appreciate you and I love you all. And I think that love is also part of the work we do. And I thank you for it.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation. I'd just like to remind everyone that the pandemic made a lot of things change, but it hasn't changed your spirit. I'd like to let you know to look at the recording of our last event on the federal budget, animated by Mary Clark Walker and our excellent panelists. I'd also invite you to endorse the campaign and to follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and also to maybe fund the campaign to allow us to go more deeply. We had a panelist that wasn't able to join us, unfortunately, and we'd like to continue to always talk about this and really influence the way that we talk about cis and trans women and girls in the next electoral campaign, as well as in the future when we're talking about disabilities. Thank you so much and have an excellent day.